Something just changed in this case, and it's not small. Right when people thought things were slowing down, the feds made another move. Quiet, calculated. And according to reports, they're now looking to bring even more charges into an already heavy RICO case tied to Lil Durk and the OTF circle. Listen, this isn't just an update, this is escalation. Because when federal prosecutors start adding charges late in the game, especially in a RICO, it usually means one of two things. Either they found something new, or they're tightening pressure in a way that changes everything for the people involved. And right in the middle of that pressure, you've got OTF Dede making a move of his own. He's not waiting. He's now pushing for bond, trying to get out before trial even begins. And that alone tells you something. Because nobody files for bond this aggressively unless staying inside is becoming a bigger problem than expected. But here's where it gets serious. According to what's being said, these new charges could pull in older incidents that weren't originally part of the case. And if that's true, it's not just about one situation anymore, it's about building a pattern, a bigger picture, the kind that juries don't ignore. Nothing is confirmed yet, but the timing? It doesn't feel random. Because with a trial date already in motion, adding charges now could delay everything again and keep everyone sitting in uncertainty even longer. And that raises the real question. Are the feds building a stronger case, or are they applying pressure to force something behind the scenes? Because whichever one it is, this case just got a lot more serious. The first thing people are trying to understand right now is why this case keeps expanding instead of narrowing down. Because usually when a federal case gets closer to trial, things become more focused, charges get cleaner, arguments get tighter. But here, it's moving in the opposite direction. And that's what's raising attention around Lil Durk and everyone tied into this OTF situation. So the timeline matters. This case didn't start small, but it also didn't start this wide. Early on, it was centered around specific allegations tied to conspiracy and violence. But over time, according to reports, more layers have been added. And now, with the possibility of new charges being filed, it's starting to look like the prosecution is trying to build something bigger than just one incident. That's where RICO comes in. Because a RICO case isn't about proving one act, it's about proving a pattern, a system, a structure where multiple actions connect back to the same organization. And if the feds can successfully show that, it doesn't matter who did what individually, as much as it matters that everyone was part of the same operation. Now bring in OTF Dede. His situation is different, but connected. He's not just waiting for trial, he's actively trying to change his position by filing for bond. And that move tells you something about the pressure inside this case. Because asking for bond at this stage means his legal team believes there's an argument to be made, that either the case has changed or the conditions of his detention should. According to reports, his family is putting up significant money to support that request. That's not unusual, but what matters more is how the court sees him. Because in federal cases, it's not just about money, it's about risk. Risk of fleeing, risk of danger, risk of interfering with the case. And right now, that risk is being evaluated in the context of everything happening around Lil Durk. Here's where things get more complicated. Because while Dede is arguing for release, the government is talking about adding more charges, and those two moves happening at the same time create tension. On one side, you have a defendant saying, "Let me out." On the other, you have prosecutors saying, "There's more to this than what's already been filed." That's not a good position to be in. Because judges don't just look at current charges, they look at potential ones too. And if there's a possibility that more serious allegations are coming, that can make it harder to justify releasing someone before trial. Now let's talk about those additional charges. According to what's being discussed, they may involve incidents that happened years ago, situations that weren't originally part of this case. And bringing those in now changes the entire structure of the trial. Because instead of focusing on one timeline, the jury would be looking at multiple events across different periods. That's powerful, because it builds a narrative, not just of what happened, but of what prosecutors believe has been happening over time. At the same time, defense teams are pushing back. They're arguing that not every incident should be connected, that just because something happened doesn't mean it belongs in this case. And that argument matters, because if the judge agrees, it can limit what the jury is allowed to hear. But if the judge allows it, then the scope of this case becomes much bigger. Now the emotional stakes start rising, because this isn't just about legal strategy anymore, it's about time. These defendants have already been sitting, waiting, while trial dates get pushed back. And every delay adds more uncertainty, more pressure, more time away from family, from normal life. That's part of why the bond request matters so much. Because from Dede's perspective, this isn't just legal, it's personal. It's about getting out, even temporarily, before the final decision is made. But from the government's perspective, the focus is different. They're looking at the long game, building a case that can hold up under federal standards, making sure every piece connects, making sure nothing falls apart once it reaches a jury, and that takes time. Now everything sits in a tense position, a case that keeps growing, a defendant trying to get out, and prosecutors potentially preparing to bring in more evidence that could change how everything is viewed. Nothing is finalized, nothing is confirmed completely, but the direction is clear. This situation isn't getting smaller, it's getting bigger. And what comes next won't just affect one person. It will shape how this entire case is understood moving forward. Now the situation starts moving faster, and this is where pressure begins to show from both sides. Because once reports came out about possible new charges, the reaction didn't stay quiet, it spread fast. And now everyone watching this case is trying to figure out what it actually means for Lil Durk and the rest of the OTF circle. Listen. This is where narratives start forming before facts are fully confirmed. One side of the audience is saying this is a clear sign the feds are building something stronger, that they wouldn't risk adding charges this late unless they had more evidence to support it. According to that group, this isn't delay, it's preparation, but the other side sees it differently. Some people believe this could mean the case isn't as tight as it should be, that adding older incidents now could be a way to strengthen a case that might not stand on its own. And that idea is gaining attention because of the timing, because timing matters. If a trial is already being planned, bringing in new charges doesn't just add information fit, it resets the process. More evidence has to be reviewed. Defense teams need time to respond, and that almost always leads to delays. Now here's where the first major shift happens. The conversation stops being about if the trial will be delayed and starts becoming about how long. Because if these additional charges actually get filed, everything moves back again. And for the people sitting inside waiting, that's not a small detail. That's months, sometimes years, of uncertainty being extended. That's where OTF Dede's bond request becomes more important. Because his legal team isn't just asking for release randomly, they're reacting to what's happening. If the case is about to expand and delay again, then staying locked up without a clear timeline becomes harder to justify from their perspective. But here's the problem. The same thing that helps his argument also hurts it, because if prosecutors are adding more serious allegations, the judge has to consider that risk. And in federal court, risk usually outweighs comfort. Even if someone isn't proven guilty yet, the possibility of what they're facing can influence whether they stay in custody. That's the reality of this level of case. Now let's talk about those older incidents being mentioned. According to discussions, one involves a situation from 2022 and another goes back even further. And bringing those into the case isn't just about adding charges, it's about shaping a narrative. Because in a RICO case, every incident isn't isolated, it's connected. It becomes part of a story the prosecution is trying to tell, a story about pattern, behavior, and structure. And if they can present multiple incidents across different years, it strengthens that story in front of a jury, even if each incident isn't fully proven on its own. Now here's where things get more intense. Defense teams are pushing back hard against this. They're arguing that bringing in older cases that may not directly involve every defendant creates unfair prejudice, that it paints a picture before facts are fully established. And that argument is important because judges have to decide what's fair for a jury to hear. But if the judge allows it, then the scope of the case expands in a way that's difficult to reverse. Now the public reaction continues building. Some people are saying this proves the feds have been working behind the scenes this whole time, that they've been holding back information and are now ready to bring it forward. Others are saying this is exactly how pressure is applied, to force decisions before trial even begins. Nothing is confirmed, but both perspectives are being discussed at the same time, and that keeps the situation unstable. Meanwhile, attention stays locked on Lil Durk, because no matter how many co-defendants are involved, His name carries weight. His position in the case affects how everything else is viewed. And if additional incidents tie back to him even indirectly, that changes the overall perception. Now everything sits in a more intense position than before. Possible new charges, a bond request under pressure, and a trial timeline that feels less certain by the day. No final decisions have been made yet, but the direction is becoming clearer. This case isn't slowing down. It's building, and whatever comes next is going to push it even further. Now the situation moves into a different phase, and this is where things stop being about headlines and start becoming about strategy. Because once new charges are even being considered, both sides begin adjusting in ways the public doesn't always see. And right now, everything around Lil Durk and this OTF case feels like it's being handled more carefully than before. Listen, this isn't just escalation anymore. This is positioning. The prosecution, based on what's being discussed, isn't just trying to prove one situation. They're trying to build a structure that holds under pressure. And in a RICO case, that means showing continuity, showing that incidents across different years aren't random, but connected. That's why bringing up older situations matters so much. Not because of what each one proves individually, but because of what they suggest collectively. Now, from the defense side, the strategy becomes different. Because once multiple incidents get introduced, the focus shifts to separation, breaking connections, arguing that just because events exist doesn't mean they belong in the same narrative. And that's where things get technical, because if they can successfully separate those incidents from the core case, they reduce the weight of what the jury sees. But if they can't, then everything stays connected. And that's where the pressure builds. Now bring the focus back to OTF Dede. His bond request isn't happening in isolation. It's happening inside this expanding situation, and that timing is critical. Because while his legal team is arguing for release, the prosecution is potentially increasing the seriousness of the case around him. That creates a conflict. On one side, he's saying, I shouldn't have to sit here while this keeps getting delayed. On the other side, the government is essentially saying, this situation may be bigger than what's already been presented. And judges tend to lean toward caution when those two things collide. Now here's where it gets more complex, because according to discussions, some of these additional incidents may not directly involve every defendant. That creates another layer of argument. Defense teams can say, why should my client be affected by something they weren't part of? And in a normal case, that argument carries weight. But in a RICO case, it works differently. Because the prosecution doesn't need to prove that every person did every act. They need to prove that everyone was part of the same overall structure. And if they can do that, then individual distance from specific incidents doesn't necessarily remove responsibility. That's what makes this kind of case so difficult to defend. Now here's where speculation starts increasing. Some people believe the feds might have additional evidence that hasn't been revealed yet. Not confirmed, but suggested by the way the case is evolving. Because adding charges usually comes with something behind it. Others think this could be strategic pressure, a way to force decisions before trial. Because when the stakes increase, so does the risk for everyone involved. Nothing is confirmed, but both possibilities are being discussed, and that uncertainty keeps everything tense. Now the emotional weight comes back into focus, because while legal strategies are being built on both sides, the people involved are still dealing with time, waiting, not knowing when things will actually move forward. And every delay, especially if new charges are added, extends that waiting period. That's where frustration builds. And that frustration is part of why moves like bond requests happen. Because at some point, waiting becomes its own issue. Meanwhile, attention stays centered on Lil Durk, because regardless of how many names are involved, his position shapes how the case is viewed publicly. If additional incidents tie into his narrative, even indirectly, it affects the overall perception of everything else. Now everything is moving in a tighter space. Less speculation about if something will happen, more focus on when and how, because the direction is clear, the case is expanding, the pressure is increasing, and both sides are preparing for a situation that may look very different from how it started. Nothing has been finalized yet, but the setup is already in place. And whatever comes next won't just add to this case, it will redefine it completely. Now everything reaches the point where the case stops building quietly and starts defining itself. Because at this stage, it's no longer just about what might happen. It's about what the court is going to allow and what the jury will eventually see. And right now, everything surrounding Lil Durk and this OTF RICO is sitting right on that edge. Listen, the biggest shift isn't just the possibility of new charges. It's what those charges represent, because if the court allows these additional incidents to come in, then the story the prosecution tells becomes much broader. It stops being about one situation and turns into a timeline. Multiple events, different years, all connected under one idea. And once that happens, it's hard to separate. Now the focus moves to the judge, because this is where control changes hands. Up until now, both sides have been preparing, arguing, positioning. But the judge decides what gets in and what stays out. And that decision doesn't just affect details, it affects the entire direction of the trial, if those additional incidents are allowed. The prosecution gains momentum. If they're limited or denied, the defense gains ground. That's the turning point. Now bring it back to OTF Dede, because his situation becomes even more difficult in this phase. His request for bond is now being evaluated in the middle of a case that may be expanding. And expansion in federal court usually means more caution, not less. So even if his legal team presents strong arguments, the timing works against him. Because judges aren't just looking at who he is, they're looking at what this case might become. Now here's where the pressure peaks, because if additional charges are filed, everything resets again. New timelines, new motions, more delays, and that means more time before any final outcome is reached. For the defense, that's a challenge. For the prosecution, that can be strategy, because time can work both ways. It gives the defense more time to prepare, but it also gives the government more time to strengthen its case. And in federal court, that balance matters. Now attention stays centered on Lil Durk because his position influences how everything else is interpreted. If the narrative around him becomes stronger through additional incidents, it doesn't just affect him, it shapes how the entire group is viewed. That's the reality of a RICO. One central figure can impact everyone connected. Now here's where partial clarity starts forming. Not full answers, but direction. The case isn't collapsing, it's evolving. And the moves being made, adding charges, pushing timelines, challenging bond, are all part of that evolution. Still, major questions remain. Will the new charges actually be filed? Will the judge allow those older incidents into the case? Will anyone be granted bond before trial? None of those questions have answers yet, but they will determine everything that comes next. Now everything sits at its highest tension point, because the foundation of the case is already built, and what happens next won't add to it, it will shape how it stands. If the prosecution succeeds in expanding the case, the stakes rise across the board. If the defense limits that expansion, the focus narrows and their position strengthens. That's where things stand. A case that started strong is now getting more complex. A defendant trying to get out is facing increasing pressure, and a courtroom that's about to decide how big this situation actually becomes. Nothing is finished, nothing is resolved, but one thing is clear. The next move, whatever it is, won't just change the timeline, it will change the outcome. If you've been following this closely, then you already understand. This isn't just another case update. This is a situation that's still unfolding in real time, and every move from here matters. So stay locked in. Because if Lil Durk or anyone tied to this OTF case steps forward with a statement, or if the court makes a decision on these new charges or OTF Dede's bond, everything you just heard could shift instantly. One ruling could change the timeline. One piece of evidence could change the narrative. And when that happens, you don't want to be catching up late. You want to understand it as it happens, with context, not confusion. So make sure you're subscribed, turn notifications on, not for hype, but for clarity. Because federal cases like this don't resolve all at once. They move in stages, and the smallest update can carry the biggest weight. Now here's the real question. Do you think the feds are building a stronger case piece by piece, or are they applying pressure to force decisions before this ever reaches a full trial? And if more charges keep coming, does that mean they're getting closer to the truth, or just expanding the story until something sticks?